welcome to the Bonsai Wire podcast. I'm sitting here today with Michael Hagedorn,
Hello.
And I think that we're going to be talking about pines.
Oh, yeah.
So specifically, I think we're probably talking about Japanese black pines.
Yes.
We might touch on a couple of other subjects, but Japanese black pine is kind of what we're focusing on. So why don't we start by you kind of talking about your history with black pines, what kind of experience you've had growing black pines or working on black pines? What's your passion around the black pine?
Right. Then we're going to punt to you.
Sounds great.
Quickly after that, because we had this idea of talking about black pines from two different perspectives, from growing a young plant and then maintaining an older one.
Yeah.
So my experience with black pine was initially with Boone Manicativipart, who has a lot and worked with a lot and taught a lot about black pine. And it was a great beginning. So that when I got over to study with Shinji Suzuki in Japan, I found that he had none. Or very few. I don't know. So you haven't been to Suzuki. So
I haven't.
Okay. So when I was there, I think they had a grand total of 4.5 black pines. It is not a region where black pine is really ideal. It was pretty high elevation. It was right around 3,000 feet or so. So it was pretty bitter in the winter. Really beautiful, but bitter. I can't think of another bee, but it was a lot of bees. And black pine, it should have been one of them, but they were scarce. We did work on black pine, particularly at client locales. So at the client's house, we would travel often downhill, more toward Tokyo. And we would do a day of work, and then we'd scamper back to the highlands where we had our Azo spruce and white pines.
Yeah, interesting.
So maintenance. I have had a deeper history with maintenance through Boone, and then the follow up in Japan with Mr. Suzuki's clients, and then. With maintaining quite a few here in the States. And then you've had quite a different experience with, you do a lot of growing.
Yeah, a lot of growing black pine. It's one of my favorite species. I think it's interesting what you were talking about, just to kind of back up a half a step. Black pine are coastal trees, so they really are thriving kind of in a coastal, more moderate temperature.
Right. Yeah, much more common in the Osaka area and Nagoya, Tokyo.
Yeah,
you see many more.
Yeah, great. Yeah, so I really enjoy growing black pines, and the development work I did in your yard is considerably different than the growing work that I do currently. And part of that is just the pace that I'm trying to push the trees, wanting to grow fairly quickly at this point. So we're letting a bunch of extensions grow. I think probably most people have seen these really tall extensions on black pines in development. So often we'll have the tree itself might be pencil thick, but it has a 4-foot extension. Or when I was out at Telperion, we would have a 4-inch trunk with a 12-foot extension that stuck out, And so that's just, when I talked to Gary Wood that was working at Telperion, he talked about that being a straw. And the tuft at the top of the straw was, this tree is sucking up nutrient. And as
I like that.
Yeah.
I don't remember saying that, but that's a great image.
Yeah. And as it sucks it past, all these other branches, then that's where you get budding and that sort of thing happen. But he felt pretty certain that the thought was that it didn't matter so much how much was at the top of the straw, but how big the straw was. Because, obviously the size of the cambium is a lot bigger around if you've got a big trunk. You don't necessarily need a ton of foliage. So often you have these ridiculous things out in the field where it's 8 foot tall with just a handful of needles at the top and a single candle. But that thing is just rocketing the size of this tree, And so often for the first couple of years, we're doing, a couple of reed pots, and then initial wire styling on trunk line, on branches. But then you can kind of, for a couple of years, then you can kind of let the tree just grow. And, the less we mess with the tree, the more it will tend to want to grow. But then if you don't mess with it a whole lot, then you might end up with weird roots or, just a straight trunk. So you kind of have to always be playing that balance game between messing with the tree a bunch or letting the tree just be. So, I kind of like to think through, let's get the work out of the way and then let it relax and grow for a few years. And then we work on it a little bit more and then we relax and grow it. And we're even kind of playing with going, doing the work, putting it in the ground for a couple of years, just let it rocket in a couple of years, and then pulling it back out and doing a little work on it. Maybe it stays out for a year or two, and then it kind of goes in and out of the ground instead of just letting the freight train go, as it were.
Yeah. And so when are you beginning to start thinking about low branches coming from those buds? Do you worry about that at all in the first couple of years, or is that not a concern?
Yeah, I think that's the big problem that we have to always be dealing with, because the tree wants to grow tall and straight, and it doesn't necessarily want that branching, but we have to force it to put branches in. With black pines, we have 2 or maybe 3 years before the needles fall off. And if we don't get the buds out of the needles, then we have to try to get an advantageous bud, which is a lot harder. So I really need to be pushing my buds out prior to loss of needles. So it's, on the one hand, I want to grow the tree as hard and fast as it can. But on the other hand, we have to figure out how to push those buds out before it gets too late. So
interesting. So it's easier for you to get a needle bud than an adventitious bud in the first couple of years.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
that's interesting. So I have seen that actually, where you've managed to get like 20 buds coming out of 3 inches, so that and the needles are sometimes still there.
Yeah,
and the little shoots are starting to come out. And then, so later, if you miss that and those needles are gone, then would you still get 3 buds or something if you pull the needles on top?
Yeah, or if you decandle the top, or even cut the top into old needles at decandling time. Decandling time is kind of our easiest time to get back buds, and so we want to do some heavy work then. So yeah, needle pulling at the least, and then at the most we would actually remove the sacrifice, and that would force a bunch of. But again, you're always playing with like the brake pedal and the gas pedal. So if we need buds, we have to slam on the brakes, but then that slows the tree down for a while.
Yeah, but that kind of plays into this kind of wave pattern that you're talking about pushing the tree and then taking a step back and working on some details and then pushing the tree again. Is the pushing when you go back in the ground with the tree? So you're taking the tree out and putting it into a pot and then putting it back?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, put it back in the ground, and then, hopefully we've had some kind of like root spread work, and we've got some buds are set. They may not have fully developed, but we have buds, and then we put it in the ground and let it really go.
So for a chewing-sized tree, where we might be going for maybe a 2-inch trunk at maximum, is that a 2-year cycle, or is it a 1-year cycle in and out of the ground? Is there an ideal?
Yeah, I mean, the thing that I've played with is that a 1-year cycle, the tree really is just getting into its environment. So I don't really see, if I take a 1 year in a pot and 1 year in the ground, I don't see a whole lot of difference in that first year.
So it's all slow.
It's all slow that first year, and then the tree has like sent roots into the substrate, into the soil, and then that second year it's just the going up the roller coaster. The second year it just skyrockets straight up, and then for some species, if you leave it in like a trident maple, the third year then it begins to kind of eat itself. The damage that it's doing is too great, And so for fast-growing species like Scots pines,
so you're losing movement.
We're losing movement. Yeah, we're losing movement. Yeah, and any roots that were the size of a pencil lead at year 1, by year 3 are the size of your arm, and so you got to really get them out of there. So I'm pretty convinced that you need to be pulling trees at year 2 or maybe year 3, unless it's something like a chochabai or an azo spruce that grows super slow, and then we could probably push those to 4 or 5, But yeah, if that first year, I was going to start pulling out after a year, but then realized I'm not really getting a whole lot of growth if I'm constantly disrupting it after that first year.
Okay. So then once you have the trunk the way you want it, and hopefully maybe some taper, when are you starting to work on branching, on wiring whatever you have down there that you could call a branch?
Yeah. So I think probably by like maybe the first cycle out of the ground. So let's say 2 or 3 years before you go in the ground, and then 2 or maybe 3 years in the ground. And then once they come out of the ground, that's when you can begin like selecting branches. Hopefully you've got more than you need, select branches, or let some run as sacrifices. But for the most part, that's when we can be wiring down. And really, and maybe even the last year of the ground, we can decandle.
I was just going to ask that. When do you start the decandling? Okay.
Yeah, so some things I'm decandling.
So what year are you in now?
So this is like year 5 or 6.
5 or 6.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's very helpful.
Yeah. So 5 or 6 start decandling, and I like to decandle in the ground. I mean, any work that we can do in the ground that's rough, the tree will respond a lot faster too. It'll heal a lot quicker. And so do that first decandling while it's in the ground.
Okay.
And then 9 months later, that's when we're digging it up, and then we can kind of refine the branching and wire it out. But by decandling, it kind of slows the girth of the branches down, so we don't have branches that are getting too big to wire a year later.
Right. That becomes clunky, where you start to have the branch get almost as thick as the trunk.
Yeah, right.
Then you're losing what you're working for.
Yeah, and I think the thing that I've noticed that I have to be careful with, though, is when I start decandling, that just encourages the top to go stronger, and so I kind of have to both decandle and then beat the top back a little harder. Fewer needles, make sure there's only one candle. Because, sometimes we'll even see the top run. We decandle, the top runs hard and starts killing off the lower branching. So, again, kind of have to balance those two extremes.
Have you experimented at all with when you're decandling? We have a sort of a typical leave 5 pairs kinds of ideas, and I have heard that some growers will go down to 2 pairs, for instance, to really slow down the tree, to kind of minimize energy, so you get some shorter length. So they're talking about very small trees.
Yeah, really small trees. Yeah, I totally see the benefit of that, especially if I've got a lot of buds happening in the same place. By just reducing needles on each one down to quite a few, that really helps. Because the shade and the lack of just the airflow causes issues, especially in our climate. So really kind of minimizing what's down in that congestion once you start decandling. I think that's key, especially on little trees.
And that's interesting. So now maybe I could talk a little bit about development once a tree's a little bit older, because that is where it begins to shift a little bit. So usually when we first begin to design a tree, and it's in a bonsai pot, that is, and then you're starting to do some fine wiring and decandling and whatnot, and very often those trees don't have an awful lot of branching. So in the past, I've often left, I've more like eyeballed it rather than counted. You leave this, this tuft of foliage. There might be 10 pairs of needles, because there's just not that many twigs on the tree. So you have to make up for that by leaving more needle on the tree. So we are talking about a tree, this Japanese black pine, that is one of the strongest plants that we work with. So it's apically dominant. John was just talking about how you can use that dominance in order to create the structure of the tree faster by using the volume of the straw that you leave as an extension off the top in order to grow the lower trunk. And the fatter you can make that straw, the fatter the lower trunk and the bigger the nabari. But then you're in a bonsai pot after, I don't know, maybe you're at year 8 or 10 at this point, and then you have some branching to work with. And what I'm saying is that sometimes that's a little thin, and you might be leaving more needles than you're familiar with leaving for a plant that you're decandling. If you have a lot of twigage on it, you might be leaving 5 pairs. But this apical dominance is something that begins to become something that is more of a liability in the development of a Japanese black pine, where John is using it as a positive thing.
Sure, yeah.
Then it begins to shift. So once you get into a bonsai pot, you have to control that apical dominance and continue to strengthen the lower branches. Now, sometimes we have to work on branch thickness at this point, so that we have thicker branches on the bottom and thinner branches on top in order to create some sort of believable natural history. And so we might want to leave some of those lower branches growing and not decandle them for 1, 2, even 3 years occasionally, especially if you have a really weak branch down there and you're not getting much extension. But as John has been talking about, once it does begin to develop this kind of the momentum down the racetrack, or the train. Once it begins to have that kind of momentum, it picks up so fast that it can almost get too far ahead of you. And that's where you kind of want to rein it in by cutting it back to a branch where you can develop taper in your lower branch, and you'll have the thickness that you want. So there's a problem that develops. Now I'm skipping several decades ahead, where when you have a very old tree, you encounter a different kind of problem. And this problem, there's a couple problems I want to offer. The first one is, on a Japanese black pine, you can encounter an issue where you're decandling everything the same, and you create a situation where you have a continually strong top, and the bottom seems strong, but it actually begins to lose power over time. Mm-hmm. This is if you do everything evenly. Even if you're pulling needles correctly, where you're pulling more on the top and leaving more on the bottom, you can end up with a problem which is kind of strange. You end up getting more buds on the lower branches where there is no bark, which is where you're going to get a bud. Once a pine develops bark, you're very unlikely. There's only a few pines that we use that will create a bud through bark, that epicormic growth. Quite unusual. There's a few pines in the southeast of the United States where you can go walking in the woods and you can find shoots coming out of the trunk, that just arose, that year or something. And that's very unusual, though. You're not going to find a ponderosa doing that. You're not going to find a Japanese black pine doing that, or Scots pine, or any of these. But what you can find on these old Japanese black pine, and I see it more on Japanese black pine than most other pines, is that the lower branches will create an awful lot of fine buds on those lower branches, and very little budding on top, which sounds exciting, right? So, great, yeah, we got a lot of budding. But the problem is that the more small buds that you create down there, if you don't pull some off, it ends up weakening the whole branch.
Yeah, I got it.
And then if you continue to decandle the ends of it, the inside where you have this budding happening, pretty soon it drains enough energy from the outside so that suddenly you're skipping years in decandling areas because the buds are so small, and then you suddenly have this imbalance that seems to have created itself. So it's one of the things to keep an eye out for with an older Japanese black pine. So this is a tree that's been established for a long time. The answer to this is a little bit counterintuitive. You need to take off some of the buds. Just leave the ones where it makes sense. Something to cut back to, something for density, and on the bottom. And then on top, to leave a few more shoots than you want, which will reduce the shoot length up there. And then later in the fall, you can cut off the ones that you don't want. So it ends up, you can fight it. You can fight it back to balance, but it takes a bit of thinking and also being a little more aggressive with your how many needles you're leaving in different areas will also help. But the problems change depending upon the age of the tree.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I want to talk a little bit about developing the kind of the middle season. So maybe once it gets into a bonsai pot, or right before it gets into a bonsai pot, we're developing branching. I see branching being developed differently, in different places in America, but then also between America and Japan. So sometimes we see. So I guess a question would be. It seems like that we often see in American bonsai growing a sacrificial branch that emerges from low on the trunk and grows out like. So when we were earlier talking about sacrificial branch, we really want a sacrificial trunk line, a single bud at the very apex of the tree. That's what's driving the energy.
Good clarification.
But I also see people running sacrifices from fairly low on the tree. And even some shohin in Japan have big scars low where it seems like they were running sacrifices to bulk up the bari. To clarify the question, on the one extreme, we have a branch that we just let that branch run, and we let it run with a single bud, same as the top, and we let that get fatter, 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 fatter. And then at some point, we either graft back in, cut it off, and begin our bifurcation to build our branch. Or the other system is to start from the beginning, we bifurcate, we decandle the pine, the small little branch, and then we decandle it again, and we bifurcate it out, and then we let some of those run to develop the thickness. So, we may not say A or B, it's some mix of the two. But yeah, I mostly see people build a big fat branch and then cut it off and then try to bifurcate it. Where I think that I often saw in your yard, Michael, that we would build the bifurcation and then let some of the bifurcation run. Then we cut back to the finer bifurcation. But
I like that second system that you're talking about because it resembles what we're doing with the tree as a whole.
Yeah.
So the branch becomes a mirror of that, a smaller version of that. So that you're decandling parts while you're letting some parts run. That way, with the branch, where you're letting one shoot or two shoots run on this branch that already has some ramification on it, then you can let that run. You can cut it back to another branch that you already have ramification on, so you're not trying to play a catch-up game with the rest of the tree.
Yeah.
And you have the thickness.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and then in that system, you can pretty easily say, okay, the bottom branch is the right thickness, the third branch is the right thickness, so then we can fully decandle those, but we might let the middle branch run or the back branch run.
Yeah, that's where you sit back with your pot of tea and take a look at your tree and say, what does it need?
Yeah.
This is a great time of year to do this. We are recording this in January. Not sure when you're listening to this. However, you can do it in summer too. They are evergreen plants.
Right. Yeah. And so I think, when I'm looking at the 4 or 5 year old trees in the ground, they look a little ridiculous because it looks like a porcupine. There's not a whole lot of extension happening at that age. We just want to set up buds, and then those begin to get decandled to begin the bifurcation process. Right. But then by year 7, 8, 9, then we're letting the bifurcated branches run. So by that time, they have 5 or 6 or 4 or 5 decandlings. So then we let some of that begin to run to build the girth at the base.
Right. Let's talk for a minute about fertilizer because in the early years you're fertilizing quite a bit, and I think that many of us think that once it gets in a bonsai pot and you want smaller elements and whatnot, then you slow down your fertilizing, and some of that might be true, but maybe how you fertilize might change. But so some of the volume doesn't really, because especially with something as strong as Japanese black pine, what you're doing is bifurcating over and over again into many smaller pieces of the same energy. I mean, so you still kind of need an astonishing amount of fertilizer to drive the engine, even when the plant is refined, even when you're decandling every single shoot on the tree. After you've cut off these extensions where you're building volume for the trunk and maybe low branches, even then you need to do that. So when I was in Japan, I was just amazed in the summertime, even into the fall, after we had decandled the tree and we started to build up the fertilizer. Of course, this starts in the spring. I'm sorry, I should start there. In the Portland area, we're starting at March 1st. Before we even see growth on the plant, there's some root growth. And we start fertilizing right then. Not a lot, but some. And we ramp it up as spring goes along. And then a week or two before decandling, you can take the fertilizer off, you cut your candle, and then you give it a pause. And then you start the ramp-up process again. So that by fall, you're fertilizing a lot. And so going back to Japan, what I saw in Japan was the surface almost covered with balls. I mean, it's just an extraordinary amount of fertilizer. But if you don't have enough, the plant will act more like a single flush pine. And it will produce a bud, and it won't know what to do. It's like, well, I'm not sure I have enough to go into the fall and grow, so I'll just stay here. I'll just be safe. So when we play in the deep end of the pool with double flush pines, we do have to change how we're managing our nutrition.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I think black pines are one of the ones on the list in my mind of things that can pretty much handle any amount of fertilizer I give it. Trident maples, these really fast growing trees. Black pine are definitely in that list of things that, so I really strongly push black pine. I will often see, multiple candle growths. It'll grow and grow needles and then grow another candle in the midsummer. And then sometimes I'll get a tiny little candle pushing out in the fall, like I want to do a third flush, But yeah, so at that point, probably I could back down a little bit, but the tree can really handle it. It's not really.
It's astonishing what
Yeah.
they can handle.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. It's like a siphon down there.
Yeah. 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 And I think that's an interesting point, as the trees get older, it's not really the right analogy, but if you think about the tips of like all of the tips of the branches being little light bulbs, they're smaller, but they are taking on, they're glowing as much as, they might take 10 of them, but an older tree has a bunch of little growth points, And so it may not look like the trees in the ground, but it still has an enormous amount of output that it's, pushing out growth in every way. So yeah, you don't necessarily need to like push it down. And I think that's maybe one thing that I'm glad to see the American bonsai scene pendulum swinging the other way, where before it was like, if you starve the trees to death or almost to death, then they look cool in a pot because they grow really short needles or whatever the thing is, But I think finally we're pendulum swinging back to saying, if we're going to be doing these heavy things like bending and decandling, then a healthy tree is what's going to handle that the most. And so, getting your trees up to full health, Right. Obviously, we don't want to grow a black pine with 9-inch needles in a tiny pot. So you have to figure out how to manage that properly. But starving the tree to almost death is not really the answer there.
Right. And then maybe we should talk just a bit about repotting and the cycle of that for a young plant and for an older plant. So since I've been taking on the older plant, I'll start backwards here then. But for black pine, you're usually at roughly a 3 to 5 year cycle, and it can be less than that if you have a really vigorous plant, which might be filling up the pot a little faster. The older the tree, the more the plant the metabolism slows down a bit. You especially see this on single flush pines where you can go over 5 years. Before repottings. But a black pine is going to be a little bit more rapid than that because it really is a strong grower. The root system is really, really strong. Of all the pines, it reminds me a bit more of like a maple, where if you don't attend to it, it becomes this block of wood inside the pot.
Yeah.
So we do need to get in there and refresh that.
Yeah. Yeah, so you said 3 to 5?
3 to 5 generally, yeah.
Yeah, we're mostly talking about black pines, but I'm grafting pines right now, and I'm grafting a client's Scots pine, and it's in a 4-inch tall pot. It's a little different game than a black pine, but it has pushed itself up 4 inches out of the pot vertically. So it's this ridiculous wad of wood up out of the pot, and you pull the pot, it's just fresh roots round and round and round and round and round.
Root over soil.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So definitely don't leave the pines that long. But now we're in a quandary because I grafted it. I don't want to do a bunch of root work on it. So then what do we do with this thing? For a year, it's like not, So anyway, yeah. But so with a young pine, I'm probably doing maybe every year for a couple, maybe every other.
So let's say you've started a seed.
Yeah, start a seed.
And it's...
So then first year is my most aggressive because the tree can handle a really aggressive at that point. So I'm cutting off taproot. I'm cutting off anything that's weird. I'm trying to lay the roots out, horizontally, best I can. And then I let it recover a year. I'll often wire it in the fall of that year. So a year and a half essentially from seed. And then 4 months later, I'm repotting it aggressively again. And some of this is a little bit of trial by fire. Like I'm going to be as aggressive as I need to be in the beginning so that I can produce, good roots. Mm-hmm. And then I might give it a year. So a year after year 1, after year 2, and then maybe after year 4. And then at year 4, when I repot it, that kind of is the that's where the triage nurse comes in and says, does this tree go in the burn pile? Does this tree go into the field because it's got good nabari, or does it go get to re-education camp, get a bunch more roots cut off, see if it actually can handle it, and get a nabari set. And then, maybe 2 years later, it goes to that same nurse and says burn pile triage, re-education or out to the field.
So it goes to the nurse a couple times.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Oh, dear.
So hopefully by the time it actually leaves the yard, it's like it has an acceptable nabari, whatever that looks like. I don't wash the roots off, but I'm taking all the soil off, and I don't hesitate to do that. But yeah, my sense is by year 8 or 10, we're putting it into good soil, and we're not, power washing the roots out.
Right. That turning the tree to the pot with a solid mass of roots and soil.
Yeah, exactly.
Doing a more normal repot. Well, any final thoughts? We could cover the name. It's actually not a black pine; it's a green pine. Sure. Yeah, there's several other green pines out there, but that one is definitely a green pine.
Oh, got it. Yeah.
Japanese green pine.
Okay, got it. Okay, well, for once and for all, it's a Japanese green pine. Yeah, the seeds are super easy to grow from seeds, so they don't even have to go in the fridge. Just soak them. Put them in the soil. You'll have little black pines everywhere. So super easy. Get out there and grow some black pines.
Wonderful.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Thank you. Cheers.
The music on today's podcast was brought to you by the fine folks at Blue Dot Sessions. Check them out at www.sessions.blue.